The chance to win? Text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB11 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 7th of March. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more. Whether it's breaking royal news, Will, please bring us up to date, or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons.
Very, very curious.
We bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Miriam Cates and you're watching GB News. Coming up in the next hour on Dewbs & Co. With new revelations every day about the number of people living in Britain illegally, we'll be asking if it's time to issue digital ID cards. And a giant gas field has been discovered under Lincolnshire that could fuel the UK's energy needs for decades. But is it too late to frack our way to energy security? And as President Trump enters into negotiations with Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine, Vice President Vance issues a stark challenge to European nations. Take a listen.
I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for.
And expectations that fathers will work full-time while mothers do the bulk of the childcare remain ingrained and unquestioned, researchers have suggested. But is this a bad thing? Should we embrace or reject traditional gender norms? And joining me tonight for a lively discussion, I've got my panel, Gavin Rice, Head of Political Economy at Onward, and Zoe Grunewold, journalist and broadcaster. But first, the latest news headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Good evening, these are your headlines. It's just gone 6 o'clock. Vance has taken aim at Britain and the EU over what he claimed was backsliding free speech and democracy. Addressing the Munich Security Conference, the US Vice President suggested there's been a retreat of fundamental values in Europe. Vance also praised Munich's hospitality despite the city reeling from yesterday's car attack that left 30 injured. The 24-year-old Afghan asylum seeker responsible has been arrested and is due in court. Vance warned that the biggest threat facing the West is not external, but the threat from within.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
Meanwhile, he also responded to Volodymyr Zelensky's concerns over a lack of a ready plan to end the war in Ukraine. It comes after Donald Trump spoke with Vladimir Putin and agreed to work very closely to end the conflict. Ukraine's president says Putin isn't preparing for peace, but to continue deceiving the world, and insists any peace deal must guarantee Ukraine's independence. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has spoken with the US Vice President, saying the UK-US special relationship is as enduring as ever and assuring they had agreed on Ukraine.
I was very encouraged in our conversations about Ukraine. All of us have this desire to bring this horrendous war to an end. We share the view that there has to be an enduring peace. We recognise that this can't be Minsk 3.0. This has to be a serious negotiated peace, and there was an agreement that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have to be part of that negotiated deal.
In other news now, an Indian man has been found guilty of raping and murdering Irish backpacker Danielle McLaughlin in Goa. Vikat Bhagat attacked the 28-year-old in 2017. Her body was discovered in a field the next day. Her family say justice has finally been achieved after an 8-year trial plagued by delays. A post-mortem found she died from brain damage and strangulation. They're now watching to see what further legal steps will follow. And it may be Valentine's Day, but love is not in the air for Bolt, Uber and Addison Lee drivers who are striking today, causing travel chaos across the UK. Thousands of drivers are logging off during peak hours today in a campaign for better pay and working conditions. The strike action is taking place across the country from 4 p.m. until 10 p.m. tonight. Those are the latest GB News headlines. Now it's back to Miriam.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome to Dewbs & Co with me, Miriam Cates, and joining me until 7 o'clock, I've got my panel, journalist and broadcaster Zoe Grunewald and Head of Political Economy at Onward, Gavin Rice. And as always, we want to know what you think about the topics we're debating today, so please do get your views in at gbnews.com/your say. Well, President Trump continues to hit the ground running, beginning negotiations with President Putin to end the Ukraine war. European leaders who've gathered today in Munich for a security summit heard a keynote speech from Vance. But instead of talking about the threat from Russia and China, the US Vice President took a very different tack. Take a listen.
I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for. And I believe deeply that there is no security if you are afraid of the voices, the opinions, and the conscience that guide your very own people. Europe faces many challenges. The crisis this continent faces right now, the crisis I believe we all face together, is one of our own making. If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you.
Well, I think it's fair to say the audience didn't particularly enjoy that speech. Let's see what our panel has to say. Let's start with you, Zoe. This was an excoriating attack on Europe, European leaders, the European project. Do you think this is fair criticism, or is this lecturing that we don't need?
I think it's lecturing, and I think it's quite hypocritical, to be honest. I mean, JD Vance would like to pretend that him and Donald Trump are, advocates of free speech, but you only have to look at Donald Trump's record so far to see that isn't the case. They've already revoked access to books for school children in the Pentagon. They've removed LGBT resources from their website. They've banned federal employees from referencing gender ideology. Donald Trump has called the media the enemy of the people. He's suing various organisations. This isn't the mark of a man who really cares about freedom of speech. And what I would say, actually, is I think Donald Trump and JD Vance want to set the terms of what is acceptable to talk about without actually really living the values that they profess to. And honestly, if he really thinks that this is more important to the Munich Security Conference and to the leaders in Europe than the threat of Russia, on the backdrop of what is happening in Ukraine, I think that's extraordinary. And I don't think European leaders will be very happy with this at all.
They certainly didn't look it.
No.
Gavin, what are your thoughts?
I've got a rather different view of this. I think, look, it's totally understandable that a European audience might react to this and think, look, we're being lectured, we're being told what to do from someone from a very different country, a very different culture, and a very different type of political party compared to many of the people in the room. But I actually think what's going on here is that I think JD Vance is actually trying to reach out to Europeans and build something of a bridge. I think what's important to get under the psychology of this is that JD Vance and Donald Trump view themselves as part of a kind of democratic revolution against what they perceive to be, or what perhaps are, depending on your point of view, a kind of old, sclerotic, liberal elite, a kind of two-party system where the fundamental ideology was essentially the same, a sense of deep stagnation that governments are not responsive to individual voters, but also kind of just a sense of broad decline. And I think what he was trying to do was actually try to appeal to a kind of common cultural or civilizational foundation that is actually perhaps shared between Europe and the United States, and draw attention to some genuinely pretty egregious things. I mean, he mentioned the example of the man in Sweden who was convicted for burning a Quran, not a very nice thing to do, but probably shouldn't be a criminal offence. There's numerous similar examples from the UK. And I think he was actually trying to lay out a little bit of a foundation of some things that could be shared in common.
Yeah, and it wasn't just free speech that he attacked. You're completely right. You could take two different points of view on this, but it was actually, what is Europe for? What are our values? What are we trying to defend? That was his kind of key point. And he has a point, doesn't he? I mean, we've kind of told ourselves that our values are diversity, inclusion, but actually that isn't what Europe was built on.
I think there is something to be said for this idea of, if Europe wants to come together as this kind of coherent bloc where they have shared values and, a vision going forward, then there do need to be conversations about what that looks like. And I think in the face of threats like Russia, like China, like global warming, like war and energy struggles, food security, it makes sense that you would want some coherence amongst these countries about what their strategy is. And, the EU has clearly encountered problems over the last couple of decades. So there is a lot of soul-searching to be done. You spoke about the election in the US as well. Clearly, that shocked the Democrats. Yes. The public aren't happy with how politics has been going. So I do understand the soul-searching, but I just think the diagnosis of the problem from JD Vance is just completely out of touch.
Well, he did single out the UK for particularly harsh criticism on what he views as threats to freedom of speech, referring to a particular case, actually, in the UK. Just take a listen to this.
And what I worry about is the threat from within. The retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes.
Now, whatever your views on abortion, a lot of people in America, particularly on the right, are looking at these new laws, which the Conservative government did bring in, that ban people from thinking or praying in certain places. I mean, surely this is... The government's got to sit up and take notice when we've been even called out for it on the international stage.
Well, I think, abortion is an extremely controversial and inflammatory example to choose. But, of course, as you rightly say, Miriam, it's actually nothing to do with abortion whatsoever. What he's talking about is whether it should be a criminal offence to do something which is fundamentally peaceful and non-violent and does no damage to property on a piece of public land, which historically in our common law system it never has been. So I do think he is definitely onto a really kind of worrying trend that is developing in the UK and Europe. But I think a bit of an irony in all of this is that if you want to talk about the kind of the deeper diversity, equality, inclusion ideology, which has clearly got some sort of authoritarian instincts when it comes to freedom of speech, the example that he gives. Actually, a lot of it originates from America. Now, I don't think it actually originates from JD Vance. Yeah. I think he and his political allies are trying to stage something of a kind of a counteraction against this. But actually, a lot of this culture emerges from American universities, from American corporate offices, from HR departments in companies that have got their headquarters in the United States. And, there can sometimes, particularly on the right in this country, be a tendency to just blame the state and just blame governments for these kind of creeping draconian laws and principles and constraints on our freedom. Actually, a lot of this is coming from the private sector as well.
And it's an unwanted American import, if you like. Now, so, of course, the reason for this conference was not to bash Brits about free speech, but it was to look at European security. And Trump has, unsurprisingly, but still to the shock of European leaders, basically come out and said, we're not going to support European security. security anymore. You're on your own. Do you think Europe can stand up for itself, particularly against the threat of Putin and perhaps China?
Well, I think it needs to, because I think making concessions to Putin over Ukraine is very dangerous indeed. I think there are two things that are going to happen here. Either Putin is going to feel empowered by the fact that the US is rang him first and says, there are going to have to be some territorial concessions, so he won't feel the need to strike a peace deal. Or he will strike a peace deal, he'll get territorial concessions, he'll come back a few years later wanting more. And I think Europe is wise to this. I think the idea that in some way, you are able to appease Putin through this is very, very unwise. And I think what is quite clear is that Donald Trump now feels more aligned in some ways to Putin than he does to the rest of Europe and Putin's interests. And I think that's worrying. And I think if Europe were to take this seriously, they would need to band together and think about what their security alliance looks like now without the US being a supporter.
But I suppose Trump would say to Europe, you had your chance. We have supported Ukraine, but not fully enough to help them win. Obviously, we haven't put boots on the ground for probably very good reasons. But you can see from Trump's point of view where he thinks, well, what's at stake for him?
I mean, it's a complex conflict. And as you say, at this point, it really feels like if the war keeps going, Ukraine could well lose. So obviously, everybody wants this conflict to end. But my worry is particularly about this relationship between Trump and Putin. And, even back in 2016, there were links between some people who worked with Trump and Putin. And there still are questions about those relationships. I do not think that Trump has the interests of Europe and Ukraine at his heart. I think he has the interests of Russia.
I think that, if I may, I think that's a little bit of hyperbole. If Donald Trump genuinely was somehow insidiously on Putin's side in all of this, then he wouldn't be demanding that NATO steps up its defence spending in a conflict in which NATO is on Ukraine's side. So, if I may, I don't think that actually makes any sense at all. What he's saying, and Boris Johnson was on the airwaves saying this only earlier today, is that the United States is asking for Europe and for the rest of NATO to contribute more, which I think is completely fair enough. I think on the question of Ukraine NATO membership, it's a really difficult one because obviously, we in the West, deeply behind Ukraine, democratic, sovereign country trying to defend its own territory from a completely unjustified authoritarian aggressor. On the other hand, you can see the perspective that if Ukraine were to join NATO, that would create a legal obligation for countries like the United Kingdom to go to war with Russia, a nuclear power, in the event that, imagine there is a deal, that the war starts up again in the future if Ukraine were to join NATO. And that strikes me as a really quite dangerous situation to be in. So I think there's actually a degree of realism in that as well.
Thank you. Well, we'll see what transpires. It'll be interesting to see the reactions of the newspapers to the Vance speech tomorrow. Anyway, well, coming up, do stay with us. A potential clash between Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband could erupt as the discovery of a giant gas field could power up the UK for a decade. Is it time to get fracking? Do you agree, disagree? Well, don't go anywhere. We'll be discussing it.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Join me, Nana Akua, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Lately, it's getting much better. People getting more educated in terms of overall well-being of the skin health rather than temporary aesthetic treatments. Because most of the treatments in aesthetic, it doesn't change the texture of the skin. It just gives like volumetric result or remove the wrinkles temporarily.
So what are the most popular treatments that people are after?
According to a statistic report, first is anti-wrinkle, then dermal filler, then energy-based device.
Yeah.
But lately, biostimulators also became very popular. And
what do you mean by biostimulators?
Biostimulator, any substance that can change the texture of the skin, or like it will lead to postpone the aging process, or proliferate more collagen, increase the elasticity of the skin, such as polynucleotide or exosome, or different vitamins and minerals in a form of mesotherapy considered as a biostimulator.
Turkey's a particularly popular destination because the costs are so much lower. There have also been a lot of horror stories about what can happen when things go wrong, even people dying from post-surgery complications. What would you advise people?
Choose as a practitioner or surgeon very carefully and never prioritize price over quality. This is your face after all, your body after all. And mistakes can be reversible. It can be irreversible, and sometimes it's not like a booking restaurant or hotel. It's a sensitive matter that can affect their confidence and skin and body for life. So they need to choose very wisely. They need to search what kind of methodology that particular surgeon they perform the treatments. Are they using any safety tools?
GB News, the People's Channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Miriam Cates, and keeping me company until 7 o'clock. I've still got journalist and broadcaster Zoe Groenewold and Gavin Rice, who's head of political economy at Onward, and you've been getting in touch with your views. Lots of support for the JD Vance speech. Peter says JD Vance 100% correct. Hopefully, though doubtfully, this will lead to a change here, and maybe, just maybe, civilization can be saved. Jan says, brilliant speech. The EU leaders might not have enjoyed it. They definitely didn't, but I did. And Marilyn says, Miriam, JD Vance was brilliant and said so much that so many of us believe. Well, lots of support for Vance then. Well, moving on, a giant gas field has been discovered under Lincolnshire that could fuel the UK's entire energy needs for a decade. Edgen Resources, who's the company behind the discovery, says this could reduce Britain's dependence on gas imports and generate tens of thousands of jobs. It's understood that exploiting the Gainsborough Trough field could add up to £112 billion to GDP. But the find is likely to reignite the debate about fracking. Gavin, where do you stand on fracking? I mean, we've been discussing this for a long time. I think it was government policy before 2019 that it was open to fracking, but then there were these minor earthquakes caused by a drill in Lancashire, I think, that then put a complete ban on fracking. Do you think it's time, in the interest of energy security, to have another go?
Well, I think when it comes to the question of fracking, my answer is a little bit like the old Irish expression, you wouldn't start from here, right? I'm not an expert on energy policy, but my instinct is that if we were going to do fracking, the right time to start that would have been 5 to 10 years ago, and then we might finally be seeing some dividends pay off, simply because, you know, amongst other things, it just takes so long to get anything done and built in this country. Obviously, there's profound political opposition at the local level. People famously are, you know, as the expression goes, people are NIMBYs. They don't like things being built in their local area. I can't imagine people going for it at the local level. There is a really serious question to be asked, though, about what Britain's future energy mix looks like. Labour are absolutely committed to full decarbonisation of the grid by 2030 and getting to net zero at an incredibly fast pace. But the way in which that's currently being delivered is not by replacing fossil fuel supply comprehensively with renewable supply. It's actually with reducing demand. So the UK has reduced its consumption of electricity by 36% since 2003, which is more than
in 20 years?
Yes, which is more than any other OECD country. So what we're actually doing is we're basically deindustrialising. So it's not that we're replacing our supply of energy, we're just committing ourselves to using less energy. And you can see that our economy is clearly suffering as a result. So I don't know if fracking is the answer, but there does need to be some kind of plan which doesn't throw our economy on the fire.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the energy question is a huge one, and we know that Labour recently have been putting a lot of effort into particularly their nuclear plans, you know, really trying to scale that up. And nuclear is one of those things where it is incredibly costly, and it only, you know, it has benefits, but only in the grand scheme of other sort of energy sources being being placed in as well, because it kind of stabilises them because it's not weather dependent or like renewables are. In terms of fracking, I mean, I'm not in favour of fracking. I think, you know, we have our climate objectives, we have our net zero targets. I don't see how I think fracking would take us away from those. But I think from even like a business perspective, you know, this is talking about this gas field discovery could power Britain for a decade. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying. And then what? You know, and then after we have taken ourselves back into reliance on oil and gas, and we haven't put as much of that effort into possibly our renewables at the same time.
But even ardent environmentalists would say we do need gas for the transition. We are not going to be fully reliant on wind and solar, if ever, but for a long time. And actually, isn't it better to get our own gas, and shale gas is actually cleaner than other gas, get our own gas and at least be buying it from our own country rather than importing it from
Well, I have a question about that, because my understanding of gas is that it works on a kind of global market.
Well, the prices, it wouldn't reduce the price.
Yes.
But obviously the taxes that the corporation tax, the VAT, all the other taxes would actually come into the UK Treasury rather than going to Norway or America, wherever we buy it from now.
Potentially. So, I mean, there can be economic benefits to it. I think you're right. It probably wouldn't bring the cost of oil and gas down. I think if we're talking about where we should focus our attention, it needs to be on renewables, it needs to be on nuclear, and potentially, as you say, some of that oil and gas to get us over the line. But this is also about where the global investment sits, right? Countries are increasingly putting their attention onto renewables, and I think if we went back to focusing too much on oil and gas, we could miss the boat.
Gavin, I just want to come back to what you were saying about the reduction in energy that we're using. I've got a graph that we can show now, which shows the line that's going upwards as UK energy prices, and the stable line is US energy prices. You can see just how much they've diverged over recent years, which I think shows that renewables, unfortunately, have not brought prices down. But also, it does speak to what you were saying, that we have deindustrialised. You know, we can't produce steel anymore. We can't produce all these things because our energy costs are so high. You know, what does that mean for our future industrially?
Well, I mean, it's really bad news. The UK's reduced its manufacturing sector to just 8% of GDP, which is lower than any other comparable economy, and that's catastrophic, particularly for communities and parts of our country that lie outside the Greater South East, that were historically much more dependent upon manufacturing. But the thing is, it would make sense if this was actually contributing to a reduction in overall global emissions, but unfortunately, what has been happening is that we've been simply exporting our emissions to other parts of the world, particularly China. You know, that helps us to hit our domestic net zero target because, you know, the emissions aren't occurring here. But what we're doing is we're simply just sending them to another part of the world, increasing Chinese emissions, and we're also adding on the emissions that come from the tanker that it takes to, you know, to transport things around the world, whether it's steel products or whatever it may be. So I actually think the conversation needs to be about how do we contribute most to reducing global emissions, not just how do we reduce our own emissions unilaterally when other countries
offloading them to someone
we're just offloading the problem to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, and I think there also needs to be a conversation about which I think Labour are trying to have, which is about how do we make ourselves relevant in this new green push. So what sort of industry are we building? Do we try and get ahead on the green technologies? Are we looking at research and innovation? Are we making sure that we are empowering these towns, these new towns, but also old towns across the country to take advantage of this new global market? And I think that is important if we want to see not only an economic boost from this, but also, as you pointed out, make sure we're reducing our own emissions domestically.
But I think that what's most important to viewers sitting at home is the cost. How much does it cost to heat your home? How much does it cost to put your light bulbs on? And we've seen from that graph, you know, the UK is now paying some of the highest prices for energy in the whole world. And it's very difficult to see how the government's going to reduce the cost of living or boost business or improve our exports unless we can do something about this. And it doesn't feel like the drive to renewables is working.
But a lot of that is because of the price of oil and gas and the instability in the global market. And arguably, if we had less reliance on global sources, you know, Russia, the US or whatever else, and had more domestic homegrown energy, we would be better insulated.
Indeed, but for a time at least, we're going to have fossil fuels. But just quickly, before we have to move on, the politics of this are going to be very interesting because you can see a Labour government that's desperate for growth might be quite keen on this, but a certain Ed Miliband might stand in their way.
Well, that's absolutely right. And we've all heard of the rows happening behind the scenes between Rachel Reeves in the Treasury and Ed Miliband at the Energy Department. I mean, clearly there's an ideological difference on this. Ed Miliband himself refused to rule out, actually, in the House of Commons only this week, whether the UK would actually end up having a higher carbon price than that in Europe. But I think on the politics of it more broadly, there's basically been a bit of a lack of honesty, I would say, from all sides about this, because you're absolutely right. We are hugely import exposed. We haven't invested in domestic energy supply, either on the fossil fuel side, because we've been saying no to things like North Sea oil and gas. We haven't fracked, but also we haven't invested enough in renewables to actually replace what we're not creating domestically on the fossil fuel side. It would actually cost significantly more, either to industry, bills, or the taxpayer, probably all three, to actually invest as much as we need to.
Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of views on that at home, so please do get in touch. Don't go anywhere, because after the break, expectations that fathers will work full-time while mothers do the bulk of the childcare remain ingrained and unquestioned. That's what research has suggested. But is this a bad thing? Should we embrace or reject traditional gender norms? And what about the social norm of being courteous in public? Should we ban music being played out loud on buses and trains? Don't go anywhere.
Ready to soak up that holiday sunshine?
Won't we need some cover?
No worries. All sorted.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
If you're looking to escape the cold weather in the UK and find some winter sun, it will be fine in Spain this weekend, but rather unsettled through much of Italy and Greece, an area of low pressure, and the Burao wind for Croatia continues to blow very strong, particularly towards the north. Meanwhile, much more settled weather, above average temperatures and plenty of sunshine through the Balearics, Spain as well, but an area of rain is going to push into Portugal, and that's going to likely affect parts of the Canaries next few days.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
Good evening, I'm here with your latest GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. Through this weekend, I think Sunday's going to be the drier of the 2 days. That's because many of us are going to have some fairly wet weather pushing through as we go through tomorrow due to a frontal system that's already brought rain across parts of southwest England, Wales and Northern Ireland so far today, and it's going to continue to progress northeastwards overnight. That being said, not really reaching the far north of Scotland or the southeast, where it's going to stay largely dry. With the rain, it is going to be quite heavy at times across parts of Wales and the southwest, but as well as this, we do have the risk of some sleet, some snow, even a bit of freezing rain. Temperatures to start the night are going to drop where we get some clear skies, so a touch of frost early on, but then it's going to turn a bit milder with some cloudier, wetter, milder weather pushing its way in. Taking a closer look first thing tomorrow morning across the southeast, largely dry but quite cloudy here, wetter further west, also quite a bit of rain across parts of Wales, northern England, and do watch out for some snow and some freezing rain leading to some icy patches if you're heading out tomorrow as well. Across Northern Ireland, the heaviest rain will have cleared through, and across Scotland, a bit of a west-east split. Across western parts, largely dry by around 8-9 o'clock, and there will be some glimmers of sunshine, but in the east it's cloudier with some outbreaks of rain, sleet and hill snow continuing. Then through the day, we have a fairly wet picture across this kind of central slice of the country. To the far south, avoiding this, in fact, across the southwest, things turning brighter later on, and further north-northwest, some glimmers of sunshine across some parts of Scotland. Temperatures are turning a bit milder from the west, but where you're stuck under the cloud with the rain, it is going to feel pretty chilly. Into Sunday, and it's a drier day, not totally dry. There will be some outbreaks of mostly light rain coming in from the east, some wintry showers across parts of Scotland, and even a bit of rain pushing into the far west too. But elsewhere, something a bit drier, perhaps even a bit brighter at times. And there's something a bit brighter to come early next week, but further rain arriving from the west. Bye-bye.
The latest GB News travel.
Good evening. The M62 is slow towards Hull. There are emergency repairs happening and an oil spill to clear following an accident where 3 lorries were involved before the M18 at junction 35. The other way, towards Manchester from Huddersfield, a queue at 20 Rochdale where there's been an accident. Slow here, 21 Milne Row. The M6 Cheshire, this is queuing northbound. There's been an accident. Thelwall Viaduct. 2 lanes are shut before 21 at Woolston. The M1 is still closed in Bedfordshire on the northbound side. 10 Luton Airport to 11 at Dunstable. The A13 is shut east of London. That's Rainham area both ways with queues between Barking and Purfleet. And if you're travelling east Sussex, Brighton to Port Slade, there's a queue where the A27 Southwick Tunnel is still shut. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. with me, Miriam Cates, and keeping me company until 7 o'clock. I've got my panel, journalist and broadcaster Zoe Grunewald and Gavin Rice, Head of Political Economy at Onward. And lots of people have been getting in touch about fracking. Unanimous agreement that it is what we should do. A GB News viewer who remains anonymous says, drill, baby, drill. Self-sufficient until the nuclear option is up and running. John says, perhaps we could use the new gas field to create a national wealth fund similar to Norway's. Very good idea. Please do keep sending in your views. Moving on, expectations that fathers will work full-time while mothers do most of the childcare, even if the mother is the higher earner, remain ingrained and unquestioned, research has suggested. So this is a study by University College London, and it found that a lack of joint discussion among couples means that traditional gender roles are being perpetuated in parenthood. The researcher involved, Claire Stovall, suggested that more shared paternity leave might address the imbalance. But is this just a solution in search of a problem? Zoe, isn't it just to be expected that particularly in the very earliest years of a child's life, the mother will be more likely to want to stay at home and look after the child?
Well, look, I don't have children, but I do see having children at some point in my life, and I think it's absolutely vital that women are given the opportunity to decide what they want to do. So if women want to stay at home and look after their kids, they should be able to do that. Equally, if a woman wants to go back to work as soon as she can, I think she should be able to do that too. And I think what is really important is that we have structures in place in the workplace and outside of it to make sure that parents can make that decision. In some families, it might be that it makes sense for the mum to stay at home, and it might be that it makes sense for the husband to go back to work. But it's not like that in every scenario. And I think especially if you're in a couple where the woman earns more money and perhaps, wants to take advantage of that and go back to work, then we should have a system in place that allows that. I mean, couples shouldn't feel a financial penalty because women are still expected to do most of the child rearing.
Gavin, isn't the problem that actually there is a huge financial penalty to having children, whether you are the mum or the dad, because the only support that the state will give you is to put your child in institutional childcare. And if you don't want to do that, you're at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I read this story that apparently men are doing all the work and women are still staying at home, I'd like to know who these couples are, because every single couple that I know is in the exact opposite situation where they're both having to work full-time, longer hours than they perhaps want to, because otherwise they simply just can't afford to live. There'd have been no way they'd have been able to afford to start a family without 2 full-time salaries. So I think this might be a bit of a, what's the phrase, a luxury problem that I don't think rings true, certainly in my experience. But you are absolutely right. I completely agree with everything that's been said about choice. What's really clear is that parents do want to spend more time with their kids in the early years, especially when their child is under 5, rather than less. That was the finding of a poll that I commissioned several years ago that I think you were involved with as well. And that's unsurprising. And yet the only form of childcare support that we provide is completely geared towards getting both parents back into the workplace full-time as fast as physically possible. The reason for that is that the government, the Treasury in particular, wants to have more people working. It wants to have the tax revenue because it doesn't want to have people out of the workplace. It's much more economically beneficial from its point of view that everyone is working. But then, of course, there's a long-term downside of that, which is that it's too expensive to have a family. And lots of young people, and not that young people, but people who are parents or want to be parents, are saying they can't afford kids or they can't afford to have as many kids as they'd like.
Equally, I would just point out that childcare has been so prohibitively expensive that it may sound like a luxury problem, but actually for some women it has been the case that they need to quit work because childcare has been more expensive than what they earn, which again is a completely ridiculous problem. We shouldn't have in this country a childcare system that's so prohibitive that people can't work. We have an employment crisis.
But part of the problem of that is that we are so pushed to institutionalise childcare, which is just much more expensive than giving people tax breaks, let's say, so they don't have to work as hard, or allowing kind of transferable vouchers to be given to grandma or auntie, which other countries do. And actually, one of our problems is we tax families so much that it's the cost of childcare as a proportion of net income that's actually so high, rather than the childcare itself. But I'm only picking on you because you're our left-wing representative, but why do the left have a problem about talking about motherhood? Because, when somebody like me, who's known to be a right-winger, stands up and says, actually, lots of mums do want to stay at home, which is the truth, lots of people on the left say, oh, you just want women to stay in the kitchen.
I mean, as I said...
I'm not accusing you of saying this at all,
It's a good point. I mean, as I said when I opened my comments, I think women should be able to do what they want to do. So if women want to stay at home and look after their kids, I feel like they should be able to do that. Equally, I think it's a completely reasonable decision to want to go back to work. And just for men, there are plenty of men who say, I want to stay at home and look after my kids. You know, my sister recently had a baby, and at present they do shared paternity and maternity leave, and it's actually her husband who spent more time at home looking after the baby. He's loved it. He's felt so close to the child, you know, and that also, with paternity leave being so short and paternity pay being so unequal, it's also meant that men have not been able to experience the bonding that they might have wanted to do with their child. So I think it actually benefits both men and women to have a more equalised maternity and paternity system. And of course, when we speak, it's just important that we acknowledge that women should have a choice.
Yes,
that's ultimate, and they shouldn't be shamed for either decision that they make.
Well, one party that does seem to be getting in on the family policy idea is Reform, and Rupert Lowe tweeted out today, we need to make it easier for people to have children, front-load the system to pay more child benefits to parents in the early years. Mums and dads should be given support to spend time with their young children. Something has to change soon. Well, it's very interesting because Labour and the Conservatives have not really talked about this problem yet, so it would be fantastic to have a bit of competition between the parties. Well, we've been talking about gender norms, which of course have changed enormously over recent decades, but so have a lot of other social norms, including the norm of being courteous on public transport. And passengers are becoming increasingly frustrated as buses and trains are plagued by people playing music on high volumes or conducting loud conversations. But can anything really be done about this? Gavin, I know this is a pet hate of yours, as it is of mine, because Alison Pearson actually wrote a column on this in The Telegraph, where she inserted an image of a tweet that I'd written after an experience challenging somebody on the train. I asked a 50-year-old man to turn his music down, to which he refused, and I was actually retweeting what you said, which was also complaining about the same problem. So what are we going to do? This is a dreadful problem.
This is, of all of the problems facing the country, whether it is, it's tanking economy, whether it's crime, whether it's energy, whether it's, mass immigration, whatever it is, this is actually the thing that annoys me most on a daily basis, because it is an everyday experience of, undermining you for your quality of life, but also it brings in so many aspects of, it brings in culture, it brings in parenting, it brings in, standards in public life, ethics. When I was a kid, I would have been... my parents would not have stood it if I had a device that was blaring out loud in public, and I just would have been told this is antisocial and you have to switch it off, and other people would have complained. And that's just something that doesn't happen now because people are too embarrassed, or they're afraid that they're going to get a hostile response. Very occasionally on public transport in London, the tube, the bus, you do see someone say to someone, hey, could you turn that down, please? And either they get a really angry reaction or they just get a completely blank stare because people have lost any sense that this is actually a problem. It's been completely normalised. Technology is obviously playing a part, but I do think it's something that's only happened in the last 2 years. I would be all in favour of Singapore-style draconian crackdown, ban it, put people in prison.
Would you get that far?
I probably wouldn't put people in prison, but I do find it very, very annoying. And I think just like drinking alcohol on public transport or being, particularly kind of being abusive to a bus driver, I think it should be seen as something that we shouldn't tolerate. I think it's really disruptive and rude, and it really winds me up as well, to be honest. I was thinking about it, and I do think it has something to do with the fact that phones have evolved to no longer have a headphone jack. Because it used to be the case that everyone had loads of pairs of headphones. You'd always have one in your bag. You'd always have one on the kitchen counter. It was really easy to find one. And they were quite cheap as well. If you were out and about without them, you could pick some up for £5. Now, a lot of them are wireless, and actually wireless headphones, I think they're a lot easier to lose. And I think they also tend to be much more expensive. And they lose charge. So people just think, oh, I'll just play it out loud. And I think as well, people are very addicted to their phones. So they've really struggled to come off them. And I think you're right. We've developed a kind of... we've allowed something that shouldn't be a norm to become a norm, and I think because we're very individualised now as well, people don't really respond to someone telling you, please turn that down, it's very disruptive.
It does seem to be a symptom of the kind of atomisation of society, and stigma used to play a huge role in how people behaved in public. I remember my mum saying that when she was a child, you wouldn't even eat in public. That was seen as, not the done thing to do, but now we just don't have that kind of stigma anymore.
Well, I think you've got technology and culture coming together, and there's a horrible feedback loop between them. Kind of the more instantly scrollable the technology becomes, and the more social media moves towards video and short reels and things, the more addictive it becomes, and then people become so zombified and absorbed that they just care more about their kind of consumption and their experience than the people around them. I do think there is a point about attitudes towards the public realm and the public square as well, and the difference between public and private spaces. And I'm going to go a little bit spicy here, because I know some people have suggested that immigration has contributed to this. And I think there is an element of truth in it. And different cultures definitely do, and different countries have different senses of what is a baseline level of public noise, and different conceptions of the public versus the private space.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, if you go to Italy, it's just a much noisier country. You know, I've got friends that live in Italy, I've got Italian friends, I love Italy, I pick it because it's a country that I love. But they are much more comfortable with having devices playing out loud, video chatting people in a bar or in a restaurant. They just don't see it as a problem.
Right.
And so, you know, whereas in contrast, a country like South Korea or Japan, you have to be completely silent in public spaces. And so, you know, when you've got far more people moving to other countries globally than you ever have before, we've got to find a way of getting along together.
Yeah. But in terms of what's to do about it, I mean, I love the idea of a ban, but who would enforce it?
Well, this is the other thing, of course, because who would enforce it? I mean, you shouldn't be, you know, rude and abusive to bus drivers, but if a bus driver is, you know, having somebody abuse them or shout at them through the glass, more often than not, they'll just try to, you know, make the situation go away and drive their bus on time. You know, there is a lack of enforcers, and I think that is a part of this. But I do think what a ban would do is it would encourage some people who perhaps haven't really thought about it before, you know, to see that actually, OK, I'm not supposed to do that. And if someone points to the sign and says you're actually not supposed to play your music out loud, I do think there would be a number of people who would be receptive to that. Or maybe I'm being over-optimistic. I do think there would be.
No, I think that would help. But I think people have got to take a bit more collective responsibility. What really shocked me when I spoke up on the train on Monday and just asked this gentleman politely to turn his music down and he refused, was that nobody else said anything. And I think that's where the fear comes from, is that you might take that first step, but you'd hope that other passengers would back you up. But I'm not sure they will. Anyway, please do get in touch about what your solutions are for getting music off buses, or maybe you like music on buses. Do let us know. But don't go anywhere, because after the break, we've got new revelations every day about the number of people who are living in Britain illegally. So we'll be asking, is it time to issue digital ID cards? You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
We were talking earlier about the issue of Siri listening to you. Well, it's not just your own conversations being sort of harvested for data, but it's a problem with AI. So what seems to have happened yesterday is that Apple issued a alert saying that Luke Littler had won the darts before he had. I mean, imagine what would, you know, if he then gone on to lose, you know, how that would have looked. I mean, obviously, because he went on to win, at least they got the story right, but before it had happened. So what it seems to happen is that the AI farms existing stories, and what it has done, that's the alert. We can see the alert there now, and it also claiming that Brazilian tennis player Rafael Nadal had come out as gay, when actually a different Brazilian tennis player was actually mentioned in the original story. So what it does is you see that it's branded as BBC Sport. What the Apple AI system does is it farms alerts that it thinks people are getting from the source, and then summarises them into
that was
one.
Going to be my question.
Into one
it
alert.
Looks to me like you would assume, OK, the BBC are reporting this.
Absolutely.
Or
so the BBC
News might be saying something else.
So it could happen to any news organisation.
This has highlighted a massive issue. I mean, having editorial judgment and quality control, because if this is going on, it's just contributing to the flow of misinformation.
Yes.
And we know that this is a problem on social media, people reporting false things. But if it seems to come from trusted news sources, that is a massive issue in credibility. I mean, if you had something like Reuters, who's a big news provider, doing this, you could hold people accountable, you could make changes, but when it's the AI doing it, I mean, what do? You're going to have to reprogram it in some way.
And if you just lost control, if you're a news source, you've lost control of what goes out, because it basically farms it, puts your logo on it, and sends it out, even when it's nonsense.
GB News, the People's Channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. with me, Miriam Cates, and I've still got my panel here with me in the studio, journalist and broadcaster Zoe Grunewald and Gavin Rice, who's the head of political economy at Onward. Now, you've been getting in touch, a bit more disagreement on these topics, which is always good to see. Simon says, on the issue of music on public transport, German transport does not tolerate music or phone calls. Police get assertive to stop it. But Anne-Marie says, regarding people playing music on buses, I find it so irritating when they do that. However, we must not ban it any more than banning silent prayer. We keep banning things, it's becoming dystopian. We need to teach our young folk that it's socially unacceptable to do these things. You do it the same way you teach them to say please and thank you and wash their hands before eating. It's simple manners. Very good point. And then on our gender roles, we're talking about whether or not mums should stay at home, dads should go out to work. Keith says often women, mothers, decide they want to care for their children. And Mel says, how about resolving the expense of childcare and the cost of the taxpayer by one partner staying at home and let that partner transfer all their tax allowance to the working partner, either mum or dad. Great idea. That is certainly what they do in many other countries. Well, on to our final topic now. Every day we hear fresh revelations about asylum seekers who've had their appeals to remain in this country upheld by judges who seem determined to put the rights of often convicted criminals over the safety of the public. Today, it's been revealed that a Zimbabwean paedophile was allowed to stay in the UK because he would face hostility back home. And earlier this week, it was reported that an Albanian criminal was protected from deportation because his son didn't like the taste of foreign chicken nuggets. And these are just the cases that we know about. Last month, a study by Thames Water revealed around 1 in 13 people living in London is an undocumented immigrant. So our immigration system is out of control. But where do we go from here? Gavin, such a huge problem. But one of the suggestions from former PM Tony Blair, now almost agreed with by Chris Philp, is that perhaps we need digital ID cards. What do you think?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation about ID cards has actually moved on since the Blair era. There is now so much data that is collected, both by the government and also through private companies as well, lots of which we willingly consent to. Actually, collecting more digital information on people can be a really good thing. One of the problems in the NHS is that actually we don't have enough digital data on people. So you go from hospital A to hospital B and there's no record of what's wrong with you. So I actually think I would have been quite concerned about this move as a drift towards authoritarianism in the past. I actually think, A, technology has moved on in the way that we interact with it has, but also, B, the problem has become so bad. We now spend £3 billion a year on hotels for people who've arrived here illegally. Illegal immigration is up 25% year on year from last year, that we've got to have some kind of solution. I mean, you could envisage a situation in which if you're either someone who's claiming asylum or you're here on a temporary work visa or any other kind of visa that you have to register for an ID card, but a citizen doesn't. You can imagine a compromise like that. Yeah. But I actually think, you talked about the judges, the underlying problem goes deeper than an easy solution with ID cards.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, though? Is it a threat to freedom or a necessary safeguard?
I think it can be. I think, we've seen that across the world there are different kind of forms of almost digital ID, and Estonia is one place where we've seen that it can work fairly successfully. I think I do have issues over things like privacy, over things like how it can contribute to discrimination. If fallen into the wrong hands, it can be used to target minorities, and then you can also see how it can exclude people, homeless people, for example. And, you know, there's also issues, of course, around security. So if you have everyone on a digital system, you know, that makes us quite vulnerable to hacks. And I do worry about the digital capabilities. I mean, if you look at the kind of IT that exists in our government presently, it's a real mess. So there are also questions about the cost of implementing it. We have legacy systems where certain IT systems and certain departments can't even communicate with other, which is why, you know, HMRC and DWP can't really join up their services. That being said, I do think there is an argument, like you were saying, Gavin, of having a system that is more digitised. And maybe one alternative is something like a digital unique identifier where everybody kind of has a number, almost like a national insurance number.
NHS number.
Oh, an NHS number. But our records are kind of, you know, from that you can view your records. And there could be a system where it's encrypted. And, you know, in Estonia, for example, they do it via blockchain, which makes it very hard to hack. But they are a much newer state than us. They created this in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they were able to access that technology. As it is here in the UK, we have an incredibly archaic legacy IT system. So I don't see it happening in the near future because I think it would be extortionately expensive to introduce.
That's a really good point. I think Gavin's point about the fact that our relationship with technology has changed. We give all our information to Apple and Google anyway. But my question would be that one of the problems we've got is that so many illegal immigrants work in the black economy. Now, if you're employing someone through the black economy, you don't care whether they've got a digital ID or not. You're already breaking the law. So how would it actually prevent people from taking part in these jobs?
Yeah, of course, as you rightly say, if you implemented it tomorrow, it wouldn't deal with the backlog of people already illegally working in the UK. I think certain types of tech company, I'm thinking particularly of delivery companies and so on, are clearly exploitatively making use of illegal work. Facilitating visa sharing, I'm sure. I think all of the rules around substitution, where if you're self-employed, you can just delegate your job to somebody else, are clearly playing a part in this. So there's there's the law and there's unscrupulous employers coming to, and the illegal immigration coming together to create this kind of black economy. We've got to get tighter on those companies, I think, and on issues like visa sharing. But at the end of the day, even if you implemented digital ID cards, it doesn't matter if you've actually got judges saying that person X, person Y can stay in the UK, even if the Home Office has tried to deport them. I mean, I've got a case in front of me where there was a case recently where a Nigerian woman actually joined a Nigerian separatist group so that she could say she'd be persecuted if she got home. And so we deal with the judicial activism. A technological solution isn't going to do it.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for, but thank you both so much. A really engaging discussion. Thank you at home for your comments. Thanks for watching, and Lee Anderson is up next, but I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks a lot.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. I'm here with your latest GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. Through this weekend, I think Sunday's going to be the drier of the 2 days. That's because many of us are going to have some fairly wet weather pushing through as we go through tomorrow due to a frontal system that's already brought rain across parts of southwest England, Wales and Northern Ireland so far today, and it's going to continue to progress northeastwards overnight. That being said, not really reaching the far north of Scotland or the southeast, where it's going to stay largely dry. With the rain, it is going to be quite heavy at times across parts of Wales and the southwest, but as well as this, we do have the risk of some sleet, some snow, even a bit of freezing rain. Temperatures to start the night are going to drop where we get some clear skies, so a touch of frost early on, but then it's going to turn a bit milder with some cloudier, wetter, milder weather pushing its way in. Taking a closer look first thing tomorrow morning across the southeast, largely dry but quite cloudy here, wetter further west, also quite a bit of rain across parts of Wales, northern England, and do watch out for some snow and some freezing rain leading to some icy patches if you're heading out tomorrow as well. Across Northern Ireland, the heaviest rain will have cleared through, and across Scotland, a bit of a west-east split. Across western parts, largely dry by around 8-9 o'clock, and there will be some glimmers of sunshine, but in the east, it's cloudier with some outbreaks